you that weren't able, or if you know someone that wasn't able to be with us today, they will have access to the recording, which will be available approximately a week following the webinar. You will receive an email at that time with a link to the recording and an invitation to fill out our feedback form. We are actually trying something new. The feedback form on the website, which will be in the email you will receive, is a little bit more in depth, but following the webinar today, we will invite you to fill out a couple of polls that we've put together, which is just a very quick way to get your feedback at the end of the webinar. The webinar will be 1 hour, and David, in a moment I will disappear from the screen and you'll be able to see and hear from Dave. Should also let you know that Dave's PowerPoint is available, and you can download that at any time by looking at the right-hand column of your screen. In the middle, you'll see his PowerPoint. Click and highlight the name, and then you can download the file to your computer. So we're very pleased to have Dave with us today. Dave is the director of the Center for Pioneer Learning based in Cambridge and tutor in Pioneer Mission training at Ridley Hall and Westcott House Theological Colleges in Cambridge. Before this, Dave was 7 years the vicar of the Net Church Huddersfield, which I understand was one of the first experiments of the Fresh Expressions movement. And the link to the Fresh Expressions website is, if you scroll up on the chat pod, I've posted 2 links, one to the one in the UK and one to the one in Canada. And I'm sure Dave will talk a little bit about what Fresh Expressions movement is. So Dave's role is to help dioceses, churches, and leaders think about and develop fresh expressions of church and church plants and
Great. Thank you very much, Josephine. I hope you can all hear me well, and I hope you're enjoying your time. It's about 5 o'clock here in Cambridge, which is why I'm slightly in the dark. I've got the light as well as I can to help. I want to think about today with you pioneering leadership, and I hope that you will get involved. As Josephine said, whenever I do anything, I think part of it is to learn from each other and to learn from you. And I've been using this phrase more and more, pioneering leadership, because I think we are in a time of massive change in terms of church and society, and we need a different form of leadership, a leadership which is pioneering, which is breaking the boundaries, which is changing things for this new era. And so that's what I want to think about. I want to think about what that might mean, what it might say to us from the tradition, what might it mean about working with other people, what are some of the characteristics of that kind of leadership, and what are some of the pitfalls. And so that's my hope, and I hope that it will engage with your context. Obviously I don't know all your contexts, but my hope is that you will at least better do that engagement, and that will help our conversation. There was a famous book that came out, I think it was in the 1990s, called Who Moved My Cheese? Some of you might have read it, by Dr. Spencer Johnson. And it's really a book about change, and it involves 4 characters. And 2 of them basically don't want and resist change, and 2 of them embrace the change that is going on through this book. And at one point in the book, the writer Spencer Johnson says this: sometimes things change and they're never the same again. This looks like one of those times. Life moves on, and so should we. And my suspicion, certainly here in the UK, is that we are in one of these situations. And for us, the big change, I think, probably even more so than with you in Canada, is the marginalisation of church, and the fact of what I call the refill factor no longer being there, that as long as we keep doing what we've been doing, that what happens is people just keep coming back to church, and new people are born, and people come in, and all those kind of things. And over here in Britain, certainly, we're now experiencing over 2/3 of the population having no regular contact at all with any church, and particularly the younger people, those under 20, 80% of those people have no experience with any church. And I think that's making us really think about the role of the church leader and the Christian leader, and how we engage with that and what we do. So my contention, in a sense, is that in a time of change, this is at the very moment where we need leaders who have the courage to be pioneering. But before we kind of get much further with that, I just want to think about the fact that the word pioneer is actually a word that appears in the New Testament. It's used 4 times, twice in the book of Acts and twice in Hebrews. This is probably the most famous verse, looking to Jesus, the pioneer, it's that word archegos, and perfecter of our faith. And when the word pioneer is used, it's always used of Jesus. And the word has the sense of the one who is first, the one who stands at the head of, the one who leads. And if you look at the kind of Greek Old Testament, the kind of classic pioneer then, in the Old Testament terms, was Moses, who leads the nation of Israel out into a new land. And it has very much that sense of primary, of being first. That those first few letters, arche, is that the Greek word for first. Classically used in John 1, in the beginning, is that word arche. And we won't have time to keep doing this, but I think that it is really helpful to think about Jesus as the ultimate pioneer. The writers in Hebrews and Luke in Acts very much have that sense of Jesus as the pioneer through his life and resurrection, and what he wins for us through that, his whole life. But it's also worth thinking about how Jesus was always in his ministry, as we see in the Gospels, breaking down barriers, and being first in terms of the way that he treated people, the kind of people he connected with, the way that he wanted to break down the religious barriers, the way that he met with people and talked with people, the way that he touched people that he wasn't meant to. So you get all this kind of pioneering sense from Jesus, and yet also with that is that strong sense of the tradition as well. Jesus saying, "I haven't come to break the law, but to fulfill it," and that sense that the pioneering wasn't just getting rid of the past, but in a sense, in a way, it was trying to fulfill what was the past and bring the people back to it. And someone has described pioneering, a Catholic theologian, as driving to the heart of the tradition. And I think very much that's how I see pioneering and pioneering leadership. I don't see it as, well, let's forget about the past and start completely with a blank piece of paper. As church leaders, that we're not in that kind of position, but we are in the kind of position to say what is at the heart of our tradition, and how do we renew that for a different context. That's why here in the UK we particularly use this phrase fresh expressions, because what we're trying to say is, how do we freshly express our faith and the context of our faith and our communities of faith in a new time, in a new way. And the more I've looked at church history, the more I've seen this has been a normal pattern of church life. And you see the history of many, many pioneering leaders who have enabled this to happen. So, it is important to think that, in a sense, we are pioneering leaders because we follow one who is the ultimate pioneer leader, and we work in and through him and with him. I think it's also worth thinking about how we categorize pioneering leadership. Quite often here we just use a phrase like pioneering leadership, but the more I've thought about it, the more I've realized that I think there's actually kind of some differences between pioneering leaders. There isn't just one kind of person that fits that picture. And so with a colleague I've produced this kind of what I've called a spectrum of pioneering. If you want to follow this up, it's in a book called Pioneers for Life, which I've edited and which you can get via Amazon, certainly in the UK, and there's a chapter in there called What is a Pioneer? But it seems to me that there are kind of pioneering leaders who are what I would call classic starters, who are brilliant at beginning new things. It may be from a traditional context, it may be completely outside that, but just love that new and that beginning, but get bored quite quickly and probably need to move on, maybe within a year or 2 years or 3 years of beginning something new. I think that's an important role, but we need to be aware that they can't do everything. And then I think there are pioneer sustainers. Those are pioneering leaders who are able to begin and start new things, those kind of first, but have also some of those abilities to sustain what they're beginning, and so would typically carry on with that kind of thing much longer than a pioneer starter who would love the new and getting it going, but would find the whole thing after a year or 2 years or 3 years beginning to get a bit tedious for them. And then I find within Christian ministry there are people who I would call sustainer pioneers. Now these would be people who maybe see more of their gifts in terms of pastoral, but really see the importance of pioneering leadership, and maybe alongside what they're already doing would be doing some pioneering, or classically are the kind of people who would call them others who are pioneering to work with them and would give them the freedom to pioneer and develop new things while they're sustaining and developing the things that are already there. Yeah, and then I think the kind of the other part of that spectrum is what I call sustainer developers, who are those in ministry who have that ability and to kind of just not only keep things going, but develop those things and deepen them and help them to grow. And I think that it is worthwhile. I'd be interested to know where you might think you fit in that spectrum, and it's also, I think, really helpful to think about how in a team you might need all of those categories as well, because actually if you start with a team, or if you're part of a team of just pioneer starters, you will blow out fairly quickly. You need others who come alongside you, and I see that Paul is saying that one of the dangers, I think it is, that pioneer starters are sent out alone and burn out in that first year or two. And I think that really is very true. It's true over here in the UK, Paul. And I think what needs to be done is that sense, and we'll come on to this, actually, of team, and of asking who are the kind of people that should be linking with pioneer starters. They are really good at that first and breaking new ground and finding new ways, but they need to be supported, and they need to be part of a team. Yeah, I agree, Paul. Exactly. Paul needed his Barnabas very much, and I think in much of this it is that sense of how as a church do we respond to what is changing, and how do we support that, and who are those people who are going to support it. the kind of suppose the thing I didn't put in the spectrum, which I think is really important, is the support of whoever the permission givers might be in terms of your denomination or your grouping. So it is important that I think pioneers are both supported and accountable, in a positive way accountable. And we again will come on to this because I think that's one of the really important thing. I think that is good. And I see Shirley is saying that she's one of those who naturally, as a sustainer pioneer, is looking all the time for pioneer starters. And I think that is really important. And I think sustainer pioneers tend to do that very well. I know a minister just on the outskirts here of Cambridge who has, through a quite traditional church, begun 4 new types of church. We call them fresh expressions, which operate around the kind of traditional church. And he would not be a pioneer really at all, but sees the importance of this. And it's very much about that permission giving and allowing some control to be lost to allow pioneers to really develop things and take that further. But I do think it's important to realise that we're not all the same, and to realise that not even all pioneers are the same. I think it's a really important thing, and it's a trap here in the UK that quite often we can fall into, that all pioneers are like whatever it might be, but they're not. Mike Moyner, who is part here of the National Fresh Expressions team and has written a superb book which I really recommend, called Church for Every Context, says this: if pioneering and pioneering leadership is a highly elastic concept that requires different capabilities in different settings, is there a risk of not discovering potential pioneers if the notion is stereotypes? And I think that is a danger. I think quite often pioneering leaders are seen as big characters, extroverts, that kind of thing, where actually I know some very good introverts who are pioneers. I know some very good people who might be quieter characters. We tend to think they must be this kind of age, or they must be this gender, or whatever. And my experience is that there are no stereotypes. And I think the other thing around that, as he goes on to say, are that pioneering gifts are widely distributed in the team and beyond, and the pioneer leaders to help create a context where these gifts can be exercised. And that's something here in the UK that we're really trying to do, and to respond to Paul a bit, to get away from one pioneering leader on their own to thinking much more about pioneering teams. And I think there is this danger of a kind of overarching model for pioneering leaders. Quite often those in church permission-giving roles would love to see it as kind of Mrs. or Mr. Incredible, who can solve everything and do everything for the church. And secondly, obviously, in that colonial sense, it can have that sense of pioneering is that one person on their own going out, breaking new ground. And sometimes I think that the word pioneer itself is not always the most helpful because of that. Or thirdly, I don't know if you know Alan Sugar over in your country, but these kind of entrepreneurs like Richard Branson and others who seem to be very much the kind of I'm in charge, I do it my way, and this is the way we're going, and if you don't like it, you leave type thing, which again I don't think is a very helpful image for pioneers. Stuart Murray, a Anabaptist in fact leader, says that for kind of pioneering leaders there are 4 enduring features. There's been research on them, and these are the kind of classic features that come for pioneering leaders, whether they're doing it, as I said, in a traditional context or completely new. They are people who are dissatisfied, I think, often in a positive and good way. In other words, they're not just grumblers, but they're really wanting change for the better. One of the things I do is spend quite a bit of time around entrepreneurs to learn from them, and there's a big school of entrepreneurship here at Cambridge University. And quite often I've heard them say that entrepreneurs begin with just the kind of phrase of, there must be a better way of doing this. And I suspect that a lot of pioneering leadership begins from that same thing when we think about church or the way we do church or what our group is doing. And we just have that sense of there must be a better way of doing this. Secondly, I think pioneering leadership is about vision. It is about that sense of looking beyond what is to what could be, and what it is that God is calling us to be, and responding to that. And I do think that vision is so important in this. Thirdly, I think it is about being hopeful in that right Christian sense of hope, that change actually is possible, and through that hopefulness it becomes inspiring to other people and encourages them. And lastly, risk takers, and we'll come back to this, but pioneering leaders tend to be risk takers. They act on conviction and out of their comfort zone. They are prepared to try things. I remember when we planted this church, the Net, in the north of England, I just had this sense that whatever was going to happen, we were going to try it, and I was very much of that opinion that I'd rather try it and it failed than have that sense of wondering all my life, well, I wonder what would have happened if we try that. And I think that often those of us who are more pioneering leaders are actually more comfortable with failure and are prepared to try something to see if it works. But as going back to what I was saying earlier, and this whole thing that Paul was saying, the danger of the poor person on their own, is the importance, I think, of this not just being about a person, but about being team. Thomas Cooney, writing, I think he's an American writer, says this: one of the great myths of entrepreneurship has been the notion of the leader as a lone hero. The reality is that successful entrepreneurs either built teams about them or were part of a team throughout. And I think that's a really important thing, because often, as said, our image of great entrepreneurs are these lone heroes, and yet when you look behind their stories, what you're often seeing is that they are very strongly a part of a team. And if you read management books like particularly Collins' From Good to Great and all those kind of things, they only emphasize time and time again the importance of a team. And I think for us, that's partly about creating teams that are imaginative, and they may be informal as well as formal teams, people that we gather round to just talk about things and throw ideas together. One of the things that we did for 6 months before we started this church, the Net, was literally to meet on a Tuesday night around a meal in our lounge and just imagine, just say, well, if we could do anything, what would we do? What are the things that would kind of really connect with our friends and our neighbours and our workmates, and to create some kind of imagination? Because I think too often in church we can just default back to the way that we've always done things. And I think in that team you need the people who are the innovators, who come up with the ideas that will get things started. But I think you also need the kind of bridge builders who, in a sense, bridge to reality, who say, well, that's not a good, I'm not sure that idea will work, and no one's going to buy that. But actually, that is really, this idea is really good. Really good. So I think those kind of people who earth it are really important. And then thirdly, you've got people who are persuaders. In other words, they take these dreams and imaginations and have that ability to kind of persuade other people to come on that journey with you. They can go round your community and your church and say, look, actually this is worth supporting and encouraging. Someone's asked, I think, a really good question about whether pioneering leadership applies to redeveloping, re-envisioning ministry within an existing context, and I would say absolutely. I think everything I've talked about isn't just about fresh expressions or beginning totally new things, but is about, can also be about refocusing, re-envisioning ministry and starting new things from an existing context. And I've seen much of that happening in the UK, and that's why I tend to use the language these days of pioneering leadership rather than pioneers, because I do want to say I think that really is important for those people who find themselves in traditional places, and that from that you can be exercising pioneering leadership and beginning new things around what is already there. We have this language in the UK very much of a mixed economy, by which we mean we're not saying we need to get rid of all that we've done, but we are recognizing that for the mission task of the church we also need to be beginning new things, and we need both of those things, and that they have much to say to each other in terms of the tradition and of the new, and there is that sense of both free and rooted in that, which I think is really, really important in all that kind of thing. And so I think either starting with a blank piece of paper or starting from a given context doesn't mean that pioneering leadership can't happening. And I think that's just as true in a rural context as well, and I know many of you are on that. And certainly here around Cambridge there are quite a few things happening in a rural context, because I think in many ways with all this pioneering leadership it is about taking the principles and applying them in your context. So I think of a traditional church in our rural area 20 miles out here from Cambridge, which has a very traditional Sunday service, but has also begun alongside that a monthly service in a local school, particularly aimed at the families of people in that school. And they're now finding they're getting 90 people coming along to that. This is in a small village in rural Britain. And probably 2/3 of those people have had no contact with any church before, and they've now, following the success of this over the last 2 or 3 years, begun now a new service in the traditional building for those people, which they've again have begun to find very successful. And what they found as well is that that has reinvigorated the traditional service as well, as they've kind of been reminded about what church is about and our calling and our mission. That has been really, really powerful. So I would really recommend you have a look at a book, which again I know you can get in Canada, called Mission Shaped and Rural, written by Sally Gaze. And I know that the Canadian rural is different to ours, but I think you would see some principles and examples that really do work in a rural situation, and which can be really, really well applied in that. Because I said, I think the principles to some extent are similar. It's just the context which might well be different in those kind of situations. Feel free to come back to me on any of that from your own experience. Paul says, as he said, that persuaders are so key in an established concept text, and I think that is really important. Yeah, I think too often the problem is that innovators and even the bridge builders actually burn their bridges and then are left feeling deeply, deeply frustrated. I think also when you try and gather people around you, these are some of the values that you need to be developing. So it's things like creativity, curiosity. I found one of the great ways was of enabling people, well, 20 years ago, I took them to see different things, but these days you could show them things on YouTube and DVD and all those things, not so that you copy them, because that's not what this is about, but so that it inspires you that there are other ways of doing things and just develops that sense of creativity. You've got to have a value of risk of, well, let's at least try it. It's got to be contextual. I think one of the dangers here is that people see particular models that work well, whether it's cafe church or messy church around families, and think, well, we'll just do that, rather than thinking what actually works in our particular context and how is God calling us to be his church where we are, and what might that begin to look like. The value of what I call prototypes. This is that understanding that risk actually helps us to grow and develop. So it's not about failure. Oh, we tried that and it didn't work. It is about, actually, this is a prototype for then saying, okay, what can we learn from that and how can we develop that? Over here we have a guy called James Dyson, who invented the Dyson kind of Hoover, bagless Hoover. I don't know if you have them in Canada, but very famous over here, and he's made millions of money. I discovered recently he made 531 prototypes before we had the thing that we call the Dyson today, and I think I probably would have given up about 9, and yet his willingness to keep doing that. And then I think part of the value has got to be that we're here to serve the church, but we're also here to serve our community, and that sense of humility I think is really, really important. But I do want to emphasize that I think pioneers are not go alone on their own heroes, but are very much part of a team. And I think linked to that is the importance of developing pioneering teams that are probably going to have a mixture of pioneer starters, sustainers, developers, that kind of thing as part of it. And that it just reminds us continually of what Paul is telling us, you know, that we do need each other in this. And that we all have a role and we all have a place in that. So I just want to think about some other possible clues for this, and one of them again is to go back to Scripture and these words from Ephesians 4, from quite a difficult passage to understand from the way that Paul writes it, but he writes, the gifts he gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, sorry I've written that twice, and some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. And a number of people have been saying that over the last maybe 200 years, the emphasis has been very much on pastor-teacher in terms of leadership and ministry, and we've lost sight of what is the role of the apostle today and the prophet and the evangelist, and what does that look like and what does that mean. For instance, a great book I'd really recommend is Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination, as he begins to say, well, what does it mean to be a prophet in our world today, and what does that look like? You may have seen this book, which has been influential throughout the world, The Shaping of Things to Come, by Mike Frost and Alan Hirsch, and they talk about apostles being like entrepreneurs, that prophets are called to be the questioners of our day, that evangelists are the communicators, that pastors are the ones who humanize and check everything's working well, and the teachers are the ones who look for systems and how all the things link together. And I think it is worth thinking that, again, how pioneering leadership links to these kind of things of being an apostle, which is again is just that word for one who is sent. I'm not thinking any other ways about that. How pioneering leadership is called to be prophetic, both to our society and to the sense of, as the prophets were, of calling Israel back to what they were meant to be, and of evangelism, of articulating our faith in ways that make it understandable to people. One of the books that I found really helpful as well around this, and the clues to this, is a book over here as part of the Grove series, which again you can find via the net, and it's called The Entrepreneur and the Church, by an entrepreneur who's part of a church and was based here in Cambridge, called Bill Bolton. And I really recommend you to get hold of this book via the internet, and because I think there's a lot of useful things in it. He says this at the beginning of the book as an entrepreneur. This 10 to 15% of the population, and that's what studies have suggested, have this kind of pioneering entrepreneurial skill actually in our population, should be the leaven that affects the whole. But the leaven is not able to do its job because our institutions and bureaucratic systems prevent it. The problem lies deep. Our education system, including theological colleges, which I teach at, are all too often learning regimes rather than talent spotters or developers. Our institutions stifle entrepreneurial initiative, and you may feel that for yourselves, and I certainly think that's true when I look around the church in the UK. And it is worth thinking about how people, if 10 to 15% of the population have this kind of creative, entrepreneurial, pioneering ability, that means 10 to 15% of your church have that. And how are you and others and your institution encouraging and developing that? Bolton says this, that releasing this entrepreneurial talent among God's people is the greatest task facing the church today. And again, by that, he's not just thinking about those who are paid or professional ministers, but all those within the church. And how can we release this amazing creative ability that is there across the genders, the ages, everything? What can we do to help that? He defines this kind of entrepreneurial person, which I think is very akin to the pioneering leadership, as a person who habitually creates and innovates to build something of recognized value around perceived opportunities. And he goes on to say, we just need to remember that actually, first of all, they are people. It's about us as human beings. That this kind of ability is habitual. I am definitely one of those, and I'm always thinking in that creative way, and how might I do this, and what might this look like, and how could I start this new thing? I just can't stop doing it. They are creative and innovative people in all areas of their lives, not just in church. They are builders. In other words, they do it. They're not, I think these kind of people are not just dreamers, but they are have that ability to better do it as well. And that they're always looking to build something of value. In other words, they want to create something that will really make a difference. And they build that using opportunities. They're always perceiving and looking for opportunities to do something, to develop something, to begin something. All the time looking for those kind of things. And Bolton argues that there are 6 facets of an entrepreneur, and he tries to use the word facet so it makes it a little bit tight, but these are the 6 things I'll go back that he talks about. And they don't happen in the order he's written them down, unfortunately. So he said the first thing is that it's about creativity. It's about seeing opportunities and possibilities. For us, that might be in our local community, it might be in networks that we're part of, it might be in groups or clubs or things that we belong to. It's seeing those creative opportunities. But secondly, it's about advantage, he said. And he said that the key thing in all this is not just seeing all the opportunities, but selecting the right one. And much research has suggested that is a key quality of kind of entrepreneurial types. And then it's that focus, that ability to then deliver on this. It's not just having all the ideas, it's not just picking the right idea, it's then being able to kind of focus on that and deliver on that. And I think that is really, really important as a kind of process by which this happens. And we might want to say that actually part of this is that whole sense of seeing what God is doing in mission and joining in and in a sense responding to his creativity and helping things to begin to happen. And then he links in with that the whole thing about ego in the sense of motivation and temperament and how important that is, and that sense of service in that. The role of team, that any creative people realize that team helps to not nullify creativity, but actually to multiply your effectiveness. And again, that social thing, that sense of finding a cause that this is part of, something that is bigger than itself. Paul's asked, do I see the entrepreneur as the identifier of a pioneer leader or one of the types of pioneer leaders? I think, Paul, this is something I pondered myself, I think I see the entrepreneur as pioneer. I think it's a very similar, they may not be exactly the same, but what I think that the kind of research on entrepreneurialism has done is help us see that we can't be a pioneer on our own, and I think entrepreneurs realize the importance of working in and through teams because they recognize that multiplies their effectiveness. So I think creative entrepreneurs are always pioneering, but they're looking for others to pioneer with them, and they recognize the need then to find others who can sustain what's happening around that. And I think that's really, really important for the life of the church and what is happening, really. Do they work best under a pioneer leader? Well, it may well be that they're one in the same. I think that I think that is important to understand that. I would say that probably I am both of those things. I'm a kind of entrepreneurial and I'm a pioneer leader at the same time. And I think often that's the way it works in those things. I think it's worth saying that entrepreneurs and pioneers are not always the same, but I do think that there is a close correlation. And the kind of entrepreneurial research, I think, has helped me to understand more about the nature of pioneering. Though, as I said, there are differences, and the danger sometimes of the business model, I think, is also worth taking into account. And I think one of the advantages of Bill Bolton's work is that he does take that into account and is working from a kind of Christian model rather than just a kind of profit and loss motive or that kind of thing. So, but thank you for that, Paul. That's really helpful. Okay, so it's made me reflect on what are the 10 key characteristics of pioneering leaders as I've seen it. And again, by that, I'll just emphasize again, I mean both people who are starting new things, but also people working from established contexts, but beginning new things within that established context. And I think firstly, it goes back to that Greek word, archegosis. They are people who are first. And it depends on the context. So, but it won't be the first person ever to have done it. But in that situation, pioneering leaders are those who are first beginning something that nobody's done in that context, that place before. They're always looking to kind of break those barriers and develop new things, and that's very much part of it. Secondly, I think pioneering leaders are often people who are on the edge, on that kind of edge between the church and its local community. Don't always sit easily in church, and I think often if you're a church leader dealing with other people who are pioneering, that can be quite difficult because they're not always, because of that, the easiest people to work with, because they are on the edge and they're kind of slightly nervous of being drawn into committees and all that kind of thing. Thirdly, I think pioneering leaders are always looking to be moving out. And by that I mean, I think you see particularly in the Acts of the Apostles both the gathering together of the church and then the kind of moving out, the scattering of it. And I think that pioneering leaders are always thinking about that moving out part. So they are wanting to gather people together. They're wanting to gather together community, but then they're thinking, how now can we multiply that community? How can we move out again to connect with others and develop the mission of God and to serve God and to bring justice and all those kind of things? How can we be continually moving out in that? Fourthly, they are people who take risks. We've talked a lot about that, and I think pioneering leaders see risks as opportunities. Sixthly, they are people who are loving change. I think that again is really important. Pioneering leaders love change. That can be a danger of changing for change's self, but it is an important thing. Seventhly, particularly for people who may be in kind of professional ministry, pioneering leaders, I think, know when to stay or go in the development of a community. And it may not just be professional leaders, but you've begun something new. When is the time to just let it flourish on its own without you? When is the time to stand aside? When is the time definitely not to do that? And I think pioneering leaders are really good at knowing those moments to let things grow and develop without them, and maybe the importance of that, of producing indigenous leadership and a new growth spurt, and when are the key times when actually you need to stay around. I also think pioneering leaders, this might seem rather strange, but know when to bring order or chaos. But you might be wondering what I mean by that. But what I mean is that there are sometimes, I think, in the life of a community where it's all getting too settled and too easy. And I think that pioneering leaders have that intuitive sense of, I need to bring something into this that will in a sense create a bit of chaos that will bring us back to what we're about and what we're doing. And sometimes in a new situation there can be that sense that there is no order, and so the pioneering leader is having to think, how can I bring some security and some order into this kind of situation. And I think also they are people sure of where they are and who they are, and I think that is, my experience has been, this has been more and more important in my thinking, that to kind of be first, to step out, to break new ground, requires a real security about ourselves in Christ, that they are sure of who they are as people and sure of who they are in terms of their calling as those belonging to Christ and serving Him. Otherwise, it can be such a difficult time starting new things that a lot of things that may not be so good within us can easily come out. Ninthly, they are, I think, people who are dissenters. And by that, I mean this kind of thing. This is from Gerald Arbuckle, a Roman Catholic theologian, who said this in his book Refounding the Church. There can be no constructive change at all, even in church, unless there is some form of dissent. And by dissent I mean simply the proposing of alternatives. And a system that is not continuously examining alternatives is not likely to evolve creatively. And I think that really is important to think about for pioneering leaders, that dissent is really important. That's saying, well, maybe there's a different way of doing this, and creating a community where people are not scared to say that, and are not just carried along because this is the way we've done it or this is the way everyone wants to do it, but to be continually, in a positive way, challenging and saying, well, is this the only way, or could we do it in a different way? And maybe there are ways that we need to be thinking that we've not thought before. And then lastly, I think they are people who reflect, connect, and don't know. And by that I mean, again, this takes away from the stereotype of the kind of pioneer leader as the person just goes off and does it. But I think that often pioneering leaders are very good at reflecting on what's been happening, what God is doing, what's working, what's not working. I think they're very good connectors at connecting with people and with ideas and bringing those together. And I also think that pioneering leaders are very good at saying, do you know what, I don't know. But I'll try and find out, and I'm not sure. And actually living with that uncertainty, I think, is a really, really important part of what it means to be a pioneering leader. Because once you have said there might be an alternative way to do it, you may well then have to say next bit, but I'm not quite sure what that might look like. And let's try a few things and see which of these seems to be the right kind of thing. And that's quite a difficult thing to do, to say as leaders, actually we don't know all the answers, and we're going to try a few things. But I do think very strongly that in this kind of world of change, that's where we're at. So do come back to me on any of that. But I just want to kind of finish our hour by briefly thinking about, okay, what are some of the icebergs, as I call them, the things that are lurking under the surface and which can really cause problems for pioneering leaders. And the first two, I think, are my experience, are definitely the biggest in this. And the first is what I call the danger of expectations. I think that, sorry, I'm just going to stop a minute there because Cheryl's asked an interesting question. How would you bring up the not knowing in a worship service so that people can sit with it? I think that, Cheryl, with that kind of thing, I would be using things like particularly silence as a way of kind of recognizing that we don't know everything, and we are there not only to worship God, but to hear what He might have to say to us in this. And just that real sense of mission being something that at the heart is God's mission, and that we are trying to then follow in His footsteps. And sometimes it's hard to see how those are working out. So I think that's how I would maybe think about that. And I'm just trying to think in the kind of biblical tradition what stories I might use of that sense of not knowing what to do. And there's certainly one or two times I can think of Paul where he's not sure how to act in mission or where to go or what to do. And I think it's very much that humble sense that this isn't just about our ideas, but it is about our trying to follow where God's mission is taking us, and how that might begin to work out. Yeah, Abraham is a really good. Thank you, Josephine. Yeah, I should have thought of that because that was an inspiration to me. Genesis 12, when I was thinking about starting this church, that sense that Abraham was told to leave and set out but didn't know the final destination. And I think that's a really, really helpful example for us. And the sense of that story is, would Abraham trust God and set out not knowing where he may end up with the promises that came with that? I think is really helpful in that sense of not knowing. Yeah, thank you, Josephine, really for that. So, danger of expectations, I think, is really, really important, because whenever you're starting something new, you've got your own expectations, you've got your church's expectations, you've got your community's expectations, you've got your denomination's expectations, you've got everyone's expectations, and they may well be different, and that can cause real problems. And I think around that is the problem of measuring this. You know, how do you know if you start a new group that it's going well? What might be the criteria, and how would your church or your denomination decide that? And it's questions like, who is the evaluation for if you're doing this? Is it for you as the leader? Is it for the group? Is it for your agency? What is the evaluation for? Is it to kind of hold you to account, or is it to help you learn and develop? And what is to be measured? Is it tasks? Is it numbers? Is it relationships? I think these are things that are really important in this, and particularly this question of, well, what measurements might be used. And I think there's a need for both what they call hard and soft information. I mean, I do think numbers mean something, because if you've started something and nobody's ever come, that might say something to you. But I think there are other questions that you would want to be asking alongside that, which is softer information. So you might well ask questions like, where have we seen signs of God's kingdom? Can you tell me a story about transformation? That kind of thing. And it is, I think, it's about expectations, and whose expectations are going to be important in this. What is the time frame for all this? What are the criteria that this is going to be measured about? And who's making the assessments in all this? And those things, I think, are really important. But under that is the importance of expectations and whose they are and who's meeting them. So that I think is really, really important to go alongside the expectations, that you've got that expectation that's coming, but also the problem of measurement. Thirdly, I think you've got this the default position. You know, the fact that all of us have this sense of this is the way it should be done, and when under pressure we go back to that. So it might be we must always meet on a Sunday whatever happens, or it might be when we do something it has to have this in it, or it doesn't have to have this, or whatever. And I think those things are all good and they're part of us and they're to do with our upbringing and everything else, but the danger is when those are unconscious and they impact us and our response. Fourthly, it's the staying the course and passing on the baton in that. To go back to what Paul said at the beginning, often because the beginning of something is so hard, actually pretty quickly the whole thing collapses. And it's seeing that long-term potential of what this is about, that this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, and it's also about passing this on to other people. I think that's really, really important. I'm aware of the time, so we've only got 2 or 3 more to come, and then we're done on this. Losing the focus, I think that again is really important, that it both either as a community or individuals or as the leader, that we quickly within this lose why we're doing this and what we're doing. And the importance of keeping that focus. I think particularly for the leader or leaders, that's a really important thing, of reminding the group, this is why we're doing it and this is what we're doing. For the leaders themselves, isolation, and I think I'm particularly thinking about relational isolation. Many pioneering leaders I talk to have the sense that no one really understands me or understands my situation. And one of the things we've been trying to do here in the UK is bring together pioneering leaders so that they can, one of the things they say, it's lovely to be with people where I don't have to continually explain myself. And I think that's really, really important. And then I think another iceberg is this, taking the tough decisions. I was listening recently to 2 leaders who've been pioneering things out of existing situations, and they both said that there came a key moment when they had to make a tough decision that was not popular with everyone to enable some of these new things to grow and develop. And they admitted how costly that was. But actually, as they reflected back, how important that whole thing was in the development of this new thing within the existing church that they were part of. And pushing through that, I think, is really important. And then lastly, this whole thing of the danger of domestication, whether it's because of our institutions or our situation or the time, that we can easily be domesticated. And I think that one of the things for pioneering leaders is that we're called not to be domesticated. One of the things I often say to leaders is, how are you staying dangerous? and I think that's a really important thing for pioneering leaders. And I just want to finish with this prayer that it reputedly comes from Sir Francis Drake here in the UK. I'm not sure whether that's true, but I just love these words for that sense of kind of driving us further into the deep to trust God and what he might be calling us to do and to pioneer. Disturb us, Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true, because we have dreamed too little, when we arrive safely, because we sailed too close to the shore. Thank you very much. I think we've just covered our hour.
I want to check that folks can hear me.
I appreciate your listening and your questions and your engagement with it. It's been very good, so thank you for that.
Can you hear me now? Okay, good, thank you. Just need to double check that sometimes.
Yep.
Dave, what a fitting way to end with that prayer, and I appreciate, and I think I speak on behalf of everyone, your insights and prompting us to explore pioneering leadership that's so much needed for our 21st century context and in so many different ways. So we thank you for that, and just a reminder to our participants, I will be posting the feedback polls momentarily. Also, this webinar has been recorded, and you will have access to that in about a week's time. And finally, thank you for participating, and we hope to see you again on future webinars. I'll sign off, and I'll put the polls up. Bye-bye.